All right, welcome everybody to our 225th episode on shallow lake management and duck hunting. It's duck hunting season coming up this weekend, so I'm Benji Cohen, your host today, and I'm going to pass it over to Nick Brown, our shallow lake specialist, to kind of talk about how we manage for ducks in some of our shallow lakes in Minnesota and a little bit about duck hunting. So, Nick, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Benji. As Benji said, my name is Nick Brown. I'm the shallow lake specialist and Red River Basin specialist for the Minnesota DNR, based out of Fergus Falls in the northwest part of the state. So I work on some shallow lakes projects right around the Fergus Falls area, and then also flood reduction damage projects up and down the Red River Basin in the northwest corner of the state. So I've got quite a lot of things going on with wetlands, but today I'm going to be focusing on shallow lake management and duck hunting. Sometimes I'll refer to it as waterfowl hunting, just depending on the slide, I suppose. So here we go. Just to give you a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about today, some general program information about the Shallow Lakes program within the Minnesota DNR. I'll talk a little bit about shallow lake ecology and how we manage those shallow lakes. In particular, I'm going to be talking about Lake Christina management. Lake Christina is a shallow lake in west central Minnesota that I am responsible for managing. And, as Benji said, we've got duck season opening up this weekend. So I'm going to talk a little bit about duck hunting tips on some of those shallow lakes and other wetlands that you find throughout the state. Minnesota's got quite a lot of shallow lake resources spread across the state. We've got about 4,000 identified shallow lakes. And when we talk about a shallow lake, we've actually got a definition of a shallow lake in Minnesota statute: anything that's greater than 50 acres, but shallower than 15 feet. So a maximum depth of 15 feet and greater than 50 acres is what we're calling a shallow lake. About 700 of those shallow lakes are within or adjacent to wildlife management areas. But in addition to wildlife management areas, there are numerous shallow lakes that are adjacent or within waterfowl production areas, state parks, state forests, national forests, other public lands. Right now, we've got 61 designated wildlife lakes. And when we say designated wildlife lake, those are have gone through what we call a designation process. And we have greater control over what we can do to manage those shallow lakes. And I'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. In addition to those, we've got about 2,100 wild rice lakes and rivers, many of which are shallow lakes. And wild rice is oftentimes managed under our shallow lakes program for the benefit of waterfowl. Here's just a map of some of the shallow lake resources that we have across the state. As you can see, shallow lakes touch just about every part of the state. Plenty in the prairie pothole region there in the shaded yellow, many more in the transition area between the forest and the prairie in the orange. But again, all throughout the state into the forested parts of the state and up in the tall grass aspen prairie parklands. So when I talk about shallow lakes, I'm differing from a deep lake because ecologically they are different. At the top of the slide, you'll see what is a typical deep lake. Oftentimes we refer to these as fish lakes. These are lakes that are in excess of 15 feet in many cases, and in many cases much greater than 15 feet. On the edges of that top slide, you'll see what we call the littoral zone. That's the zone of a lake where plants are able to grow. The photic zone encompasses that top layer of the water where some sunlight is able to reach, where we see some of our plant growth. There's a mixed layer where we have an approximate thermocline above that. So warm water at the top in the summer and very cool water at the bottom. And the aphotic zone where we don't see any sunlight penetrating that lake, and we get concentration of nutrients in that deepest part of the lake in a deep lake. In a shallow lake, we don't have those different zones. What we have is a lake that's entirely littoral. So we oftentimes see plants covering the entire bottom of a shallow lake. There's no thermal stratification, so there's not a cool layer and a warm layer of the lake. And they are very different ecologically, and we'll talk about that right here. So what we see in a shallow lake is a constant exchange of nutrients between sediments in the water column. And that's important because in a lake that's out of balance, we can see those nutrients being utilized by algae, leading to turbid waters. But oftentimes what we see in a healthy lake is just those nutrients being tied up by the submerged plants. There's less capacity to buffer external nutrient loading. So what we mean by that is the nutrients are coming in from the landscape. Oftentimes in a agricultural landscape, we'll see ditches come in, tile lines come in, bringing in nutrients into the lake, and that will accelerate some of that turbid water caused by algae. These lakes can often winter kill. So in the wintertime, we might have a 4-foot lake. We might have 3 feet of ice on that 4-foot deep lake. And what the shallow layer of water that's beneath that ice layer can go anoxic, which means it's devoid of oxygen, leading to winter kill of fish in the lake. And that's a good way for us to reset a shallow lake. Wind effects can be substantial. So in a deep lake, there was some interesting research coming out of the University of Minnesota earlier this summer, where they were looking at wakeboard boats, and those wakeboard boat impacts were only out to about 20 feet. So the wave action that's caused by those boats or by the wind, once it gets in such deep water, it's not affecting the bottom. But in a shallow lake, it can affect the bottom. It can stir up those bottom sediments and release phosphorus and other nutrients into the water column. There is a complex interaction between fish, plants, nutrients, and invertebrates in a lake. There's a feedback cycle that I'll talk about here a bit more in a few minutes. And they may switch between what we call a clear water and a turbid water state. A clear state is one that is beneficial for plant growth. It's oftentimes dominated by plant growth throughout the shallow lake. Turbid water is dominated by algal growth, poor water quality, and poor habitat for, in particular, waterfowl and other wildlife. At the top of the slide here, you'll see a couple of pictures of what we refer to as the clear state, again, dominated by plants, good water quality, and it in turn provides good habitat for many of those waterfowl and other wetland wildlife species that we're aiming for. The bottom are turbid pictures. On the bottom left is one that is dominated by algal growth. You'll see that typical blue-green type watercolor. Nobody wants to step foot in that. On the bottom right is one that is dominated by a turbidity caused by sediments. Also considerable algal growth in that picture as well. Again, this limits the amount of sunlight that can reach the bottom, thereby limiting the number of plants or the type of plants that can grow in the lake, and would otherwise provide good habitat for waterfowl. These turbid lakes typically do not. So what we see is positive feedback. So the plants help keep water clear and attract more wildlife. They keep those bottom sediments intact, and they limit the nutrients that are available to algae. In turbid water without plants, the bottom sediments are easily stirred up, thereby causing more turbidity and causing that positive feedback loop. We talk about a marble in a cup type alternative equilibria. So in very clear water states, say in the forest northeast part of the state, those lakes are typically in a clear state, and it takes quite a lot to get them to go into a turbid state. As we transition through the hardwood transition zone and into the prairie, those lakes are more often in that turbid state, and once they get in that turbid state, they're hard to manage back to a clear state lake. And what we see is in these shallow lakes are these positive feedback loops. In a clear water state, we've got a fish community that's dominated by uh, uh, predator fish like northern pike, sometimes yellow perch or walleyes. We have few planktivores. We have a lot of zooplankton that's grazing. We have low phytoplankton biomass, high macrophyte or submerged aquatic plant biomass, and little sediment resuspension, with few of those invasive fish that we don't like to see. In the turbid state, they're characterized by abundant smaller fish that feed heavily on the invertebrates that are beneficial for waterfowl in particular, allowing algae to dominate the plant community, and sediments are easily redistributed throughout the water column by abundant benthivorous fishes like common carp, like black bullheads. Um, and that's when we see that turbid water. So what do we know about shallow lakes in Minnesota? In Minnesota, again, we've got over 4,000 shallow lakes that we've identified. It's a very interesting place to work on these lakes due to the 3 different ecoregions in the state. Here on this map, we show the blue dots versus red dots. The data have been useful on many fronts, documenting management needed and results, but also giving a broader picture of shallow lake condition on a statewide level. We now have a pretty good picture of the overall condition of shallow lakes statewide. Roughly 2/3 of the lakes we survey in the prairie area are turbid, and those are identified by those red dots. As you move farther northeast into the forested part of the state, we see fewer red and more blue dots, signifying more of those lakes are in the clear water state. Those orange dots are just tannin stained lakes where we have water chemistry that's it's not necessarily um, dominated by algae or turbidity, but the water is stained anyway. Those lakes typically have pretty good plant growth, as well as those lakes that are in the clear state. There are many threats to shallow lakes across the state. We've got agricultural runoff and drainage. We've got drainage that leads to not only fewer and deeper basins, but also provides pathways for fish to spread. As I mentioned earlier, some of those fish that we see in shallow lakes, we don't necessarily want to see there. Those benthivorous fishes like common carp, here a picture in the bottom right, fathead minnows and bullheads. When we see those fish in a shallow lake, those are typically in the turbid state. And when those wetlands or shallow lakes are interconnected, we see a lot more movement of those fish in between those wetlands and shallow lakes. Climate change, we see, especially here in the west central part of the state, an increase in precipitation over the past 20 or 30 years has led to a lot more water on the landscape, and with fewer basins to hold that water on the landscape, it piles into these shallow lakes, making them much deeper. We also see warmer winters with less winter snow cover on the ice, and that leads to a reduction in winter kill of those undesirable fish species. So we see milder winters and we see more overwinter survival of fish, which are thereby uh, allowed to reproduce more, able to reproduce more. And, we see that that problem exacerbated in those shallow lakes and wetlands. Some of the climate stories we see, especially again here in west central Minnesota, um, this one is on the Minnesota DNR website. This is the Hansel Farm and Camp on Hansel Lake in Otter Tail County. You can see there the graph on the left shows precipitation by decade. In the 90s, we started to see a lot more rain after the droughty 80s. 2000s, again, more precipitation. In the past 10 or 15 years, we've seen even more precipitation. And what that's done is it's led Hansel Lake from being a shallow lake dominated by macrophytes to a shallow lake that is dominated by fish. We see more fish overwintering, and there you see the kids at the Hansel farm holding up some fish that they caught on the lake. Historic photos of this lake in Otter Tail County. On the left, you'll see 1938 photo that shows essentially 2 different basins, and the very northern part of the lake is very marshy. On the right is what we see now, one large deep basin, and it's now a fish basin. We rarely see ducks out there. We rarely see those invertebrates that the waterfowl are there to feed on. Less plant coverage in the lake, and it's now got more characteristics of a deep lake. Again, we see three different transitions, or I'm sorry, three different ecoregions in Minnesota: the forest, the transition area, and the prairie area. When we take a look at these shallow lakes in these different areas, in the forest, they're more likely to be clear. In the prairie, they're more likely to be turbid. And much of that is in response to the underlying nutrient at the landscape level. So in the forest, the landscape is it has very low nutrients, but in the prairie, the landscape has very high nutrients. That's why we see so much of the land being converted to agriculture there, is because of that high nutrient soil. So our management approaches differ among those different ecoregions. In the forest, we focus on protection. We focus on managing those lakes for wild rice. In the transition area, sometimes management is needed, and those lakes usually respond pretty well to management. But in the prairie area, oftentimes those lakes that are in need of management require an aggressive management strategy, and it's difficult to maintain aquatic plants in those lakes. So more frequent management is needed as well. As a program, we have really three primary areas of responsibility. Technical assistance is the most broad category and probably where we spend most of our time. Surveys are another main responsibility, and that's how we gather the data to provide that technical assistance. And lake designation is a big part of what we do. So when we identify a lake that we think would be a good candidate for management, we'll hold public meetings, and we'll try to go through that designation process so that we have more latitude to manage that lake for waterfowl and other wildlife going forward. At times within the program, we do direct management of shallow lakes, and I'll talk about that here a bit more in just a couple of minutes. So this is a typical survey. This lake is Grace Lake in Pine County. This particular lake might not be in the best shape. There are lots of unvegetated points identified by those magenta dots there, where we see the blue triangles, that's submerged vegetation, and the green dots, submerged and emergent vegetation. So in Pine County, we might be looking more at wild rice production rather than some of the other plants that we might focus on in the prairie areas. And we can use this information going forward. We can compare it year to year on particular lakes to see if our management is successful, if we need to change something, or if we see a decline in vegetation. That's when oftentimes when we'll initiate management. So monitoring is the first step to management, and that goes back to our surveys. Management is decided upon depending on what tools we have available to us in that area. Our goals are usually to maintain or restore aquatic plants. What we're aiming for is wildlife habitat, and in particular, waterfowl habitat. Some of our management options that we have at our disposal is drawdown on certain lakes. Some of the lakes that we have, and I'll talk about Lake Christina in a few minutes, we have pumps or water control structures on the lake that we can initiate some sort of drawdown, try to initiate that winter fish kill, and bring that lake back to a clear state. In the past, we have used rotenone. Rotenone is a fish toxicant that can provide good short-term results, but it is expensive. It's very difficult to use. It's even more difficult to obtain now, and other activities are still needed to maintain habitat after a rotenone treatment. When we can go in to a small lake, small wetland, get rid of those fish all in one burst, and we see oftentimes we'll see initial benefits from that we can try to maintain going forward. Watershed restoration is a big deal. What happens on the land is what happens on the lake. So if we see a watershed that's in very good condition above a lake, oftentimes we'll see a lake that's in good shape. When that watershed is in poor condition, there's a lot of runoff, a lot of erosion. That's when we'll see a lake that's in pretty poor shape. Surface use restrictions are in some of our shallow lakes for management. Oftentimes we'll designate a lake as a sanctuary or waterfowl refuge, limiting some of the boat traffic to protect some of those plants that are on the lake, to provide some sort of resting area for the waterfowl that might be using that lake. And finally, protection through conservation easements and acquisitions. So we might work with partners. We might go pursue a piece of property along a lake ourselves. And again, we're working in the watershed there to try to protect that watershed to maintain the habitat within a shallow lake. Just a real quick case study here is Big Rice Lake. This is in St. Louis County up by Tower. This is a traditional rice lake, as the name would suggest. It's important for waterfowl in the northeast part of the state. Wild rice, of course, has a lot of cultural and recreational uses as well. So we're trying to manage for wild rice in this lake. The problem is, for a number of different reasons, the lake is being overtaken by a native plant called pickerel weed. And so our shallow lake specialist up in that area and the rest of our program worked together, and they said, we need to try to manage this lake for wild rice going forward. What can we do? And what they decided on was we purchased an airboat and we outfitted it with these cutters on the back of the boat. So we can use this to mow down the pickerel weed within the lake and hope that those areas of pickerel weed that are controlled will then repopulate with wild rice. This is a huge project. It's a big lake. We're working with a lot of tribal area partners on this, and that's what we're trying to do. So here's a picture of what that looks like. We've got an operator in the airboat. That operator is mowing through that pickerel weed, and we've actually seen pretty good results there. So what we do is, again, we mow down the pickerel weed. That provides some open water for the wild rice to get established in that lake. So that's been working out really well. That's just one example of some of the management that we've got going on in some of our shallow lakes. The lake that I'm most familiar with is Lake Christina. Here, this is in the northwest corner of Douglas, and it spills over into Grant County as well in west central Minnesota, just north of I-94 near Ashby. It's about 4,000 acres in size. This lake is in the forest prairie transition in the north central hardwoods ecoregion. And historically, this was a critically important staging area for migrating waterfowl, especially canvasbacks. And this lake has a long history of waterfowl hunting on it. There are pictures from the turn of the 20th century where during the market hunting days, there were market hunters that would go out there and they would fill up boxcars on the rails and send boxcars full of ducks back to the Twin Cities, back to Chicago for sale in restaurants. So this has always been a historic waterfowl lake. Most of the lake is roughly 3 to 4 feet deep, except that far eastern bay on the lake that's along Highway 1 there in Douglas County. That gets quite a lot deeper, which kind of it makes management of the lake a little more difficult, but I'll talk about that a bit more. So this is just a brief history of Lake Christina. Again, this has been in a historic waterfowl lakes, since the area was settled. It's been a very good diver lake. Diver ducks, especially canvasbacks. Prior to that, there were more bluebills using the lake. But around the turn of the 20th century, that's when people started noticing more canvasbacks using the lake. And in the late 40s, they noticed the canvasbacks had really fallen off. This was a lake that in good years, up to 20% of the continental canvasbacks can be found on the lake at any time. and suddenly we were seeing reports of canvasbacks not in the tens of thousands, but in the hundreds of canvasbacks using the lake. So what happened at the time was Minnesota Department of Conservation, as it was known at the time, did a survey on the lake in the early 1950s. And what they saw was they saw a lake that had flipped from the clear state to the turbid state. So the lake was very turbid, dominated by algal growth, and very few submerged aquatic plants were there. And those submerged plants were those plants that were feeding the ducks, attracting the ducks. And that's why we saw so many canvasbacks and other waterfowl using the lake. So they thought about what to do, and in 1967 they did a toxaphene treatment on the lake. Toxaphene is another fish toxicant, much like I noted rotenone earlier. Um, uh, More toxic, and it wasn't long after this that everybody stopped using toxaphene. It's not a great thing to put into your lake, but it did the trick. It killed a lot of fish, and what happened was the fish went away, the plants came back. It reverted back to that state, that clear, stable state for at least another decade. Around the beginning of the 1980s, we saw that lake flipping back to a turbid state. So at that point, an electric fish barrier was put in at the outlet of Lake Christina, blocking fish movement from downstream, from Pelican Lake downstream. Pelican Lake is a popular fish lake. And what we did is we blocked the fish moving up and tried to manage fish within the lake that way. In 1987, another rotenone treatment was completed. Again, similar results. We wiped out the fish in the lake at that time. And what we saw was the lake reverting from that turbid state back to the clear state, better waterfowl habitat, more of what we wanted to see. But it only lasted for another decade or so. In the early 2000s, again, another rotenone treatment was completed. And the lake saw good results from that for about another decade. But it was at that time when the DNR decided that working with partners like Ducks Unlimited, the local lake association, we decided that it would be best to get away from a whole lake rotenone treatment, which are difficult and they're very expensive. And what happened is we installed pumps at the outlet of the lake so that we could do a drawdown to try to induce that winter kill. The first drawdown was done in 2012, another drawdown in 2015, another in 2018. So, and the most recent drawdown was begun in 2022. So we saw good results from these drawdowns, but they were very short-lived. And we've got a lot of data on this lake. We have plant surveys that date back to 1947, excuse me, and annual plant surveys since 1980. When the lake is in good shape, we see abundant submerged vegetation, especially sago pondweed and Chara species. Chara is a macroalgae. Sometimes it's called muskgrass. You'll bring it up when you're fishing a lot of times on your sinker or something like that. And it's got a really musky smell. It's pretty easy to identify. Other waterfowl foods that are common across the state are wild rice and wild celery. Lake Christina has had very little of either throughout its history, and we've got some, but very little emergent vegetation. A thin layer or a thin ring of cattails around the western part of the lake, and stands of bulrushes within the lake at the west end of the lake. And with those annual plant surveys going back to 1980, we've got more plant data on this lake than any other shallow lake in the state, likely in the country. So when the plants change, we've got a good idea of what's coming next. This is just some pictures of some of our plant surveys. When things are looking good, we see abundant sago pondweed, like that picture in the right hand side of the slide, and we see very clear water. That sago pondweed that's in that person's hand is full of those nutlets. The ducks are coming to that lake to eat those nutlets, to dig up the tubers of that plant, to feed on that, to fuel their migration south. That's what we're managing for. This is not a breeding waterfowl lake. We're managing this lake for the ends of the season, spring and in the fall. We're providing some migratory stopover so that those birds can fuel on their way north in the spring to their nesting grounds, and south in the fall to their wintering grounds. Again, I've mentioned that we've got excellent plant data on this lake. The blue line on this slide is all plants in the lake. The green line is Cara, and Cara is kind of our canary in the coal mine plant. When we start to see that decline, it's a pretty good bet that the rest of the plants are going to follow it within a year or two. So when we see Cara dip below 50% coverage across the lake, that's when we can identify a larger, more severe dip in plants, and those same plants that the waterfowl are there uh, that are going to be looking for. We expect to see those take a dip shortly thereafter. So right there at 2012, you can see we had quite a dip in Cara. Lost all our Cara in 2012. We had very poor submerged aquatic vegetation, so we did our first major drawdown on the lake. And since then, we've been fine-tuning, managing a bit more aggressively on the lake to try to keep some of that habitat there. And again, we do that through drawdown. This is a picture of the first drawdown in 2012. Much of the lake, most of the western edge of the lake anyway, was in a mud flat. The goal is to induce some kind of fish winter kill and stimulate aquatic plant growth the next spring. The drawdown period is started later in the summer, usually August or early September, and continued through early winter when the lake is frozen. Oftentimes that frozen water starves our pumps of water. So we have to shut the pumps down. There's a water level recovery period. Again, downstream from Lake Christina is Pelican Lake, so we want to keep some water flowing into Pelican Lake as much as we can throughout the winter, and then again in the spring, while allowing Lake Christina to come back up and provide some of that habitat for the following fall. And we're also able to do a partial drawdown, so we can get the lake, instead of all the way down to mud, we can get it down a couple of feet in the winter to try to induce some more of that winter fish kill, if indeed fish are the problem. This is a couple of pictures of Lake Christina after the 2019 drawdown. These are spring of 2019, and you'll see quite a lot of dead and floating carp. It's not a pretty sight, but what we see after this is much better habitat conditions. We see that positive feedback loop starting to work. We see fewer fish in the lake, which leads to less resuspension of sediments by these bottom feeders, which leads to clearer water, more submerged plants, and again, better habitat. So this is what we're looking for when we do a drawdown. If we hit it just right, we have low water and a tough winter, and that stresses the fish to the point where a lot of those are removed from the lake. We do other management on the lake as well. We've got the electric fish barrier at the outlet. There are a couple of fish barriers above the lake trying to keep those undesirable fish out of the lake. There's a fishing closure on the lake. This is the only lake I know of in Minnesota that is closed to all fishing all the time. There's quite a lot of land protection that's done in the watershed, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. There's a migratory waterfowl feeding and resting area on the lake, and that's important this time of year during the duck season. We close off some of that lake, some portion of the lake, to motorized boat traffic to give those birds a chance to rest and feed on the lake undisturbed. And then, of course, the continuous monitoring. We're out there every year doing plant surveys, doing water quality surveys, trying to get an idea of what shape the lake is in and whether management would be helpful or necessary. This is a slide that was put together by our partners at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. This is a great deal of work that's gone into land protection. That red line is the watershed of Lake Christina, and the more of those colored boxes we can get inside that watershed, the better shape Lake Christina is going to be in. So the amount of protected land within the watershed, that red line again, has essentially doubled in the last 10 years. Much of that is putting into working lands agreements, allowing for grazing and haying, but no row crop agriculture. Grazing and haying are excellent ways to maintain grasslands in a very good state. And when they're in the watershed of a high priority waterfowl lake, that's when we see our best results. That's all I had on shallow lakes for now. And what I wanted to do was switch over to talking about waterfowl hunting on shallow lakes. Duck hunting, goose hunting, whichever you like to do, it can happen on these shallow lakes throughout the state. Um, you know, I think what you really need to focus on first is safety. You need to make sure that you are as safe as possible to get home, get back to that boat ramp, get back to your vehicle after that duck hunt safely. It really it really increases the enjoyment of the hunt. And duck hunting can be inherently difficult, inherently dangerous. It's oftentimes done in very cold weather, cold water. Hypothermia is a real concern. So make sure you're safe out there. Wear your life jacket, your PFD. Bring lights. Oftentimes you're going out there the very first thing in the morning, well before sunrise, and it's important to know where you're going. It's important to let someone know where you're going in case there is a problem. If you're going out on a boat, I've learned this from experience. It's a good idea to bring two forms of propulsion for that boat. If it's man-made, chances are it's going to break at some point, and that includes outboard motors, that includes push pulls, that includes paddles and oars. It's important to know the lake that you're hunting. Some have a very soft bottom, and I note Christina there. It's entirely unsafe to get out of a boat and try to wade across Lake Christina. There is a very, very soft, mucky bottom, and it's easy to get stuck out there, and that can cause problems. Some of those lakes are even a bit too deep to wade, even though they are what we would call a shallow lake. It's important to know what you're shooting at, not only for duck identification, but making sure that there aren't any other hunters around. Again, you're going out there in the dark. Oftentimes you don't realize how closely you might be setting up to another hunter. And watch the weather, especially if you're going out on a boat. There are times I wished I had gone into the boat launch sooner than I ultimately did, and might have regretted staying out as long as I did. So keep an eye on that weather. Try to stay safe. Every year, right around Veterans Day, we hear stories of the Armistice Day blizzard back in 1940, when duck hunters across across Minnesota were died in terrible weather, mostly due to exposure and hypothermia. So stay safe out there. Scouting is very important for waterfowl hunting. Starting this week, the DNR will again start up the weekly waterfowl migration report. You can go to the website, the Minnesota DNR website, and sign up for those migration reports. Those are filtering in from wildlife managers from across the state. I submit one for Fergus Falls area and Lake Christina. In fact, I did so this morning. So that's going to be out there, I believe, tomorrow afternoon. Really scouting, drive around, scope out the shallow lakes, scope out those wetland habitats that you think might be good for ducks, where you think you might have good access to. Minnesota DNR Recreation Compass is an excellent resource, as is Google Earth, as are other things like Onyx is getting popular with hunters, but that's a pay subscription type service. But all of those things are good ways to scout. We didn't have those when I first started duck hunting. It was all driving around trying to find places where ducks wanted to be. So what do you look for when you're scouting for ducks? Well, it seems kind of silly, but you're looking for ducks, right? So if you drive up to a lake and you see a lot of ducks out there or a lot of geese, something that looks like it might be worthwhile hunting, take a closer look at that. Is that going to have good access? Does it have good food out there? Does it have good cover? And if you see a lot of ducks out there, chances are it's got one of the two. It's either got food or it's got cover. Sometimes you'll see ducks that are just roosting on a lake, and it might not be the best lake to hunt if they're roosting there, because oftentimes before shooting light, they'll get up, they'll leave the lake, and they won't come back until after sunset. So get out and take a look at the lake. Look for things like wild rice, like sago pondweed, like wild celery. Look for those plants. Look for invertebrates, that little bugs, snails that are floating around in the water. Ducks eat all sorts of those things. So if you see ducks and it looks like they're feeding out there, that's a good idea to take a closer look. It's important to know your ducks. I've listed here a good reference is Ducks at a Distance. This has been put out by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I believe, for decades. And it's important because different ducks have different limits when you're duck hunting. So say a green-winged teal, if you get in a green-winged teal, you might be able to shoot 6 green-winged teal, or 6 is the limit for green-winged teal. But for instance, pintails this year, the limit on pintails is 2 northern pintails. So you really need to know what you're shooting at. You need to know what you're shooting at it before you shoot at it. And then you need to make sure you can identify it properly, even when it's in your hand. Mistakes are made. Um, it's some of those things, like mallards, you can shoot 2 hens. Sometimes you might, especially early in the season, it's tough to identify these ducks before they have a lot of their breeding colors. Um, if you shoot a duck that you thought was a Drake mallard and it turns out it's a hen, well, maybe you're a little more careful going forward. So those are that's a very good thing to think about. Know what you're shooting at before you shoot at it. Know what's beyond your target, and that's basic gun safety. Gear. Uh, Duck hunting is gear intensive. You've got calls. Uh, you've got decoys. Calls and decoys are what you use to help bring the ducks and geese a little bit closer. I always tell myself I'm not duck hunting unless I use my call and put out decoys. There are other ways to shoot ducks, of course, and other ways to hunt them effectively. This is the way I prefer to do it. I like to watch my decoys. I like to see ducks come into decoys, and I like to fool them with calls. A boat is really nice for going long distances or across deep, mucky water. In some places, you can get very large boats. Other places you might have to paddle. Duck boats can be anything from what you see here, a plastic kayak type paddle boat, to I see people with $40,000 floating blinds. They've got kitchens practically built inside those blinds for a long day of comfortable duck hunting with heaters and all that. So anything you think you can reasonably hide is probably good enough for duck hunting. Dogs. I have a dog that I like to hunt with. A dog can be a big help. A lot of times ducks are pretty tough and you can shoot them, and it's your responsibility to try to retrieve that duck after you shoot it. And oftentimes you don't, oftentimes they hit the water living, and they'll swim away pretty quickly. And if you've got a boat, it's difficult to get that boat in position quickly enough to get after that duck um, really well. So that's where a dog comes in handy, and they're just fun to watch work. Of course, that's a big responsibility. Duck season is 3 months long, but my dogs are in my house 12 months out of the year. Waders are often needed, but sometimes they're a luxury. If you want to get out of your boat, if you stay in your boat, maybe you don't need waders. And of course, a shotgun loaded with non-toxic ammunition. And with modern ammunitions, really any gauge of shotgun will work. I know in the Learn to Hunt page on the Minnesota DNR, they say a 12 gauge is recommended, but really any gauge of shotgun will work so long as it's loaded with steel or some other non-toxic ammunition. So when do you go? And that's that's another thing to consider. And I always go when I can. When I can go isn't always the best time, but I like to be out there and watch the sunrise and watch the ducks work around. So sometimes I go out even knowing that it's not going to be maybe the best day. Make sure where you want to go is open. Pay attention to make sure the waterfowl season is open where you want to go. Waterfowl seasons change every year. In the southern and central zones of Minnesota this year, there are closed splits that are 5 or more days long. So make sure that the season is open. We also are past these now, but there are early teal and youth seasons that are available for hunters to get more people involved. So take advantage of those if you can. If a cold front is coming in, especially in that later October, first part of November, that's when I change my plans and I make sure I can get out and go hunting, because that's some of the best duck hunting you'll see of all season. Beware of stale birds. Again, I go when I can, And sometimes that's not a concern of mine, but stale birds are those that have been around for a while. They know where they're safe. They've seen all the decoy spreads. They're wary of decoys. Um, and oftentimes they don't work for whatever reason, and they just stay put. They stay away from you. That's tough hunting. But again, just watching the sunset and looking at the ducks out there, that can be a good time. Mornings are typically the most popular. Some people really enjoy hunting in the evenings, but sometimes all day can be really good, and that's especially dictated upon weather. If you've got a really nasty day with strong northwest winds, snow blowing, the nastier the weather, the more duck hunters get excited. So if you see those days coming up and you want to try duck hunting and you've got the gear for it, the warm clothes, the warm dry clothes, that's when I would go out. But with that, I think, Benji, I'll turn it back to you and we can go over any questions anybody might have had either about duck hunting or shallow lake management.
Nick, one of the reasons I love doing this job is because I learned so much from you guys that are out there in the field and doing all this research. I really appreciate you joining us today and sharing all this great information. So thank you. You got a couple questions coming in. Mary has one in here. Are there certain fish species that are more susceptible to dying during the winter fish kills than others?
There are, and that's not really my expertise, but there are some that are hardier than others. Common carp are actually not too difficult to kill off through winter kill, but one of the other fish that we really don't like, bullheads, those are really difficult to try to manage for through fish winter kill. So really, it's difficult to manage bullheads in that fashion. So that when we have a problem lake with bullheads, that is the problem. More frequent management is usually necessary.
Jason, a question along the same topic there. Do you physically remove the fish from the lake after the winter kill? Or if not, do they just add nitrogen to the lake and cause more problems?
Well, we do not remove the fish. Those fish are returning the nutrients back to the lake, of course, but that's um, I'll get local reports of the people who live around the lake saying, we must have had a fish kill because there are 15 eagles sitting in my lake, sitting in the tree outside of my house. Nitrogen is typically not the limiting nutrient in lakes that we're concerned about. Typically, the main nutrient we're concerned with in water management is phosphorus. Phosphorus is the nutrient that drives plant growth, that drives algal growth. When we see too much phosphorus or too much suspended phosphorus in the lake, that's when we see problems.
Oh, yeah. And fish kills are not, I mean, they occur naturally all the time
They
in a
do.
lot of lakes. We have, just in the metro area, I've been out in several lakes and been out ice fishing and noticed that there's just a very thin layer that are holding fish, and you'll start seeing them float to the top at springtime. So
That's right.
it's not something that we're out there just causing on, you know, we are doing it for management, but they also frequently occur naturally too. So
That's right. And, I mentioned it earlier, but this is because um, part of the reason is because we have this change in climate. We have less severe winters now. We see less fish winter kill. So we have more of those shallow lakes that are turning turbid.
yeah, Mary had a similar question in there about the tension between, managing shallow lakes for waterfowl and managing for fish. And most of the fish that you're managing there are not, you're not um, trying to kill off walleye. You're killing off more of the rust fish that are
That
causing issues.
That's exactly right. And I didn't mention it, but there are certain lakes that we will manage with predator fish and sport fish. Um, we've seen some research that's been conducted in Minnesota that shows that walleyes are really an effective fathead minnow predator. So in some of these lakes, some of the smaller shallow lakes, we might turn to our fisheries partners and say, hey, could you stock some walleyes in this lake? It'll help down the road. Some lakes we stock yellow perch, we'll stock northern pike, all popular game fish species. Uh, it just depends on what the problem is in the lake and, what tools we have at our disposal to manage that lake.
It's so cool. And I used to work for Trout Unlimited, and we'd hear stories about stocking trout across the country. They just dump them off the train cars into, water that they would assume was good. And here we are in 2025, just doing these very specific lake studies and managing like per lake, which is super beneficial to everything. So you guys do some great work and manage for a lot. There's a lot that goes into this, a lot of research, a lot of science that goes into these things. So I appreciate all the work that you guys do out there.
Well, we enjoy doing it. That's why we do it.
And it's great. I don't see any other questions. If you do have questions, please enter them in the chat. Like Nick was mentioning, you're a little late for the early teal season, the youth waterfowl hunt, but like Nick mentioned, waterfowl hunting is one of those things that is gear intensive and it takes a little bit of practice. So if you have the ability to get out there and meet somebody that's interested in duck hunting, please by all means see if you can arrange to get them out with you. Take somebody new out duck hunting. It's supposed to be a rather warm weekend, so I'm not for sure how the hunting's going to be this weekend. Maybe you got some recommendations on that, Nick, but getting somebody out there new just to experience it is a fantastic opportunity. It'll make your day.
Yeah, if you're interested in hunting, I would point you toward Nate Huck's talk that he gave a few weeks ago on the early teal season. Much of what he talked about for the early teal season will be applicable this weekend. One of the things he said was bring a thermocell, bring some kind of bug repellent. And I imagine it's going to be buggy out there this weekend with highs in the mid 70s and in the 80s. So, even those mornings are going to be warm and buggy. Dress appropriately and really just get out there and do it. I don't think there's no better place to be than in a marsh with the sun coming up in late September. October is better.
It's pretty rare these days, having two teenage daughters myself. It's pretty rare that we have time just to sit still and just be there and not have TV or social media or something going on that's distracting us. So
Right.
Even if it's friends or family or a neighbor that wants to get out duck hunting, it's a great time to get out there and really get to know the person and just exist and watch what's going on.
And that's another good point, Benji, is this is a social hunting sport. This isn't deer hunting by yourself in a blind a mile away from the next person. This is in the blind, in the marsh with your friends, in the boat with your friends, with a dog. Oftentimes I'm by myself and I talk to my dog a lot. So it's you don't have to be totally quiet. You don't have to be totally still. When the ducks are working, it's best to be still. It's best to be quiet. But in between flights of ducks, it's a good time to have a cup of coffee and chat with your friends and just enjoy the morning.
Yeah, that's one of the things Nick brought up too, is snacks. Snacks are key and they're important, especially when you have kids out there.
Yes.
So.
Every time I crack open my thermos to pour another cup of coffee, the ducks come in.
Well, I wish you luck out there this weekend, Nick, and anybody else going out. Be safe, enjoy the outdoors, take somebody new with you if you can. Hopefully we'll see you in a couple weeks. John Erb is joining us for our 226th episode, talking about trail cameras and how to attract animals to your trail cameras and get better photographs and see what's going on there. So until next time, go outside, be safe, and have fun, and we'll see you later.